that, we'll turn the time over to Mac Hadow. Many of you know Mac. He is our lead lobbyist, and he does a lot of our work in tandem with Jeff Foldham at the state government affairs level. We have a really, I think, a really insightful panel to follow this one, which will help, I believe, give us some insights into what we can expect, the landscape of the state efforts around innovation, access, et cetera. So look forward to digging into that with Mac.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome to everyone to what we think is a very important discussion here about what's confronting us in 2022 as we look at state patient access at the state level to rare disease therapies that are available. And so we think that this next hour is going to be, I think, a terrific opportunity for us. As we look at this and analyze where we are going, this panel, I think, will provide some terrific insights. And I want each one of them to just take a moment and introduce themselves. We'll start with former New York State Senator David Carlucci. David, could you just give everyone just a brief background in terms of your experience here? And hopefully David is unmuted. So while we resolve that, let's go to Randy. Randy, can you give us just a brief background in terms of your experience in the rare disease field?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Randy Kleitz. I serve as the Rare Disease Policy Director at the Little Hercules Foundation. I just served 2 years in the state legislature in Ohio, so I'm a former state representative. And my rare disease journey started in 2002 when my son Colton was born. 2 weeks old, he was diagnosed with severe hemophilia. Hemophilia typically has a family history, but 1/3 of the cases there's a spontaneous mutation, and that is what happened with our family. So he was diagnosed with leukemia then, just 15 months later. So he's a leukemia survivor and a severe hemophiliac. He's now 19 and doing really well. So we've been very lucky. I just shared our story just recently about how clotting factor was something that was only used when there was an actual active bleed. When my son was born in 2002, they were just starting to transition into prophylactic treatment, and we're the, I think, really good story of what can happen with a patient who gets early and safe products very timely. My son is 19 with no joint damage at all. He is living a very productive young adult life. And so we're really excited and happy that we were able to have access to safe treatment in 2002 and beyond.
Randy, thank you. And in my family, we have a history of hemophilia. So we appreciate your great work that's being done and advancing the cause here. Crystal, could we have you give us a brief introduction?
Yes, thank you. My name is Crystal Davis. I am the founding president of Texas Rare Alliance, working to improve access and health outcomes for nearly 3 million Texans living with a rare disease. I joined the rare disease community when our newborn son Hunter was diagnosed with SMA type 1. And we came into that diagnosis when there was no treatment available for a clinical trial. And we've seen the progress from really bench to bedside, which is bedside's where we want it. We want the patients getting these treatments. And my advocacy has really spanned regulatory at the FDA, working for research funding at the NIH, and then state and federal policy to improve access.
Well, thank you. And just a logistical issue, Kelsey or Katie, can you resolve the issue for Patrick? I think he's in the participant room, not on the presenter room. So if you could resolve that, he's waiting to get in. And I'd like to introduce Representative Brian Patrick Kennedy, who's the Rhode Island Speaker Pro Tempore. He also was just recently elected as the Vice President of the National Conference of State Legislatures Group. NCSL is a powerful influencer in the development of legislation that is reviewed by legislators across the country and has been a leader in the NCSL and in the Rhode Island legislature on a lot of these very difficult issues with insurance matters and that kind of thing. So Representative Kennedy, I'll let you introduce yourself here.
Thank you, Mac. So I'm in my 33rd year, hard to believe, a third of a century as a state representative in Rhode Island. During that time, I served for 20 years as the chair of the Corporations Committee. And the Corporations Committee was responsible for much of the healthcare legislation that we've had that has passed through in the state of Rhode Island. Also was very involved with the creation of our health insurance exchange and negotiating many of the pieces of legislation that we ultimately have passed in the last several years. As Mac pointed out, I'm the new vice president of the National Conference of State Legislatures. So I'm looking forward to continuing on a national role, having the opportunity to be more involved with these type of issues going forward.
Thank you, Representative Kennedy. And Representative Kennedy is now on track to become the president of NCSL here in the next couple of years. So it's a great achievement, and we welcome his friendship on this issue. Let's turn to Patrick. I think he's on now, and have him make an introduction.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Oh, great. Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm still learning the ways of Zoom. Quite frankly, it's quite embarrassing. Yeah, thank you for allowing me to join. My name is Patrick Plews. I'm Vice President for State Government Affairs at Bio. We're the trade association for the biotech industry. Many RAP members are also members of Bio. Our membership includes a lot of the gene therapy companies, as well as a small startup biotech companies that are really heavily invested in the rare disease space. So I'm pleased to be here today and give you sort of a rundown of what we're seeing in the States on some of the issues that are impacting this specific group of therapies.
Patrick, thank you. And anyone that knows Patrick knows that he's been in the trenches with us here for decades, has worked at every level, including heavily on the state work. So we welcome his expertise in this area. Let's loop back to former New York State Senator David Carlucci. I know he had a computer issue. Let's see if he's back on. David, are you with us yet? There we go.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry about that. It's an honor and a privilege to be with everyone here today. Thanks for having me, and thank you for the work that you all are doing. My experience as a former state senator for the past 10 years in New York is one of the most important things when we talk about rare diseases is that we share our story with lawmakers, but we really focus. And I always say that when we advocate on these issues, that when we leave that lawmaker's office, that we need to leave there with a specific ask, because you all get it. You've been involved in this issue. Being a state lawmaker is like drinking from a fire hose, and there's so many issues, and this issue is important, but it's hard to get the full depth and breadth. And that's why we've got to tell our story and be specific with our ask. So look forward to the panel today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David, and we appreciate your participating here today. It seems to me that there are three specific areas that we need to have some information and guidance on based on the experience of the panelists that are here. First is to examine and perhaps provide some guidance on the role that patient advocacy groups can play, and Senator Carlucci just mentioned this, in terms of identifying to state legislators and to the representatives of the executive branch, how they can most effectively provide services to families and patients with rare diseases. And then I think it's important for us to talk about the role that the federal government has in resolving access issues for families, because we know that the federal government has incentivized the innovation for many of these rare therapies with very creative carve-outs that recognize the fact that there's a marketplace that's vastly different from the typical patient population for which the broad incentive structure is set up under our drug development system in the United States. And so there has to be a continuation of the federal role in dealing with financial access and therapy access for patients in partnership with the federal government programs, because particularly with children with rare diseases, the families very quickly become presumptively eligible for Medicaid, and it requires that there be acknowledgement and recognition of that. And finally, we'll talk about the role that state governments have, both on the legislative side and the executive branch side, to determine how these access issues can be addressed, how we can eliminate some of the barriers, and they're real, because of course the state Medicaid programs and other health providers make the argument that the high expense, the high cost of these patients really diminishes their capabilities in providing a broader level of services to other patient populations. And these are difficult issues, but they require some thoughtful and hopefully some creative solutions that we can conclude with on the state government level. So let's start with the role that patient advocacy groups and the patients and families can play themselves. And I would ask Randy and Crystal to lead off on this discussion and then follow up with the others. Based on your experience and based on the best practices that you've seen, how can the patient advocacy groups play a significant role in these discussions? We'll start with Crystal, if we could.
Yeah, thank you. We're definitely seeing an evolution in this area. We used to go in and share the patient stories and really that qualitative data. Now we know that our state representatives and senators and their staff are very savvy, and they know that our treatments come with more hefty price tags. So it's not enough for us to just go in with that qualitative data. We now really must pair the qualitative data with the quantitative data on the facts and how these treatments improve the lives of the patients and the families and their communities, and also how it improves the economic impact for the states by providing pre-symptomatic diagnosis and treatment. It will mean that patients who are qualify for Medicaid waivers should never really rise to that level when there's a treatment, and that it's the private insurers that remain responsible. And then also insignificantly reducing costs associated with educational interventions and accommodations when these treatments are available. So it's very important to still share the stories, but then tie those stories with the data that really backs up the impact of these treatments and their benefits.
Great, thank you. And Randy, perhaps your perspective as you approach these issues at a state level.
So I think Crystal hit on a very clear part of how we have to share our story. But I think that in the broader sense, a lot of times, only serving for 2 years and just getting to see the other side of, after being a patient advocate and a state policy director for bleeding disorders for 10 years, and then getting on the other side of the table for just 2 years, I think it's really impactful to not just have somebody who's coming in to share one perspective of an issue, because that's typically when lawmakers have somebody coming into their office. They're very clearly there for one certain topic, and we bring in our stories and we can talk about it and how it impacts every part of our lives. And I think that that's the most important part of where we are. There's talking points for every opposition to almost every one of our issues, but when you have a parent sitting in front of you who tells you, part of our story is my husband and I got married at 19 after dating for 4 years. We didn't have our son until we were 27 because we wanted to be financially secure. And then we had all these medical issues come up and we thought we did everything right. And then we ended up with no safety net because we were a hardworking middle income family that had some rental properties because that was going to pay for me to stay at home with 3 kids. And sure, our cost of medication is very expensive, but it doesn't even touch the impacts of, we wanted 3 children and we have 1. It doesn't impact the issue that my husband has worked at the same employer since he was 15 years old because he's afraid to lose his job because that's our stability and insurance. You know, there's other things that we as families can go in and share, that there's more to this story than this one siloed issue that we're here to talk about today. But this is a thing that's impacting our families right now that you all as lawmakers can do something about today to help our families. And just making sure that, you know, sharing the big picture, but then being very clear and concise about your one issue, how you see this issue as an issue that impacts families across the spectrum of all rare diseases or chronic care. And how the lawmaker can take that issue, learn about it really quickly, be our advocates and champions at the state legislature or the federal government, and be able to be a catalyst for change.
Thank you. That's very important, I think. Patrick, you've been working on obviously from a government relations standpoint, interacting with state lawmakers and with patient advocacy groups and at the federal level as well. What do you think has been the most effective best practices that you've seen in communicating these messages from the patient advocacy standpoint to these policymakers?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the most, you know, David Carlucci mentioned this earlier, and I think this is so true. You need to go in with a specific ask because to his point, legislators are faced with hundreds, if not thousands of pieces of legislation every year. And if you go in there with a very concise message and a concise ask, it makes their job a lot easier. I think the other important thing, and I've learned this through years being lobbying both on the federal side and the state side, is be truthful. Because if you're truthful, then you are seen as a trusted informational resource to that policymaker. And I find that to be extremely important. And then finally, especially with our industry, we always do have to tie it back to the patient. That's why we work in this industry. And it's so important that we partner with a lot of the patient groups on this call, but you know, in any patient organization to, if possible, go into meetings with them or follow up with meetings that they've had and always tie our work back to what's best for the patient.
So Patrick, how do you recommend overcoming, from your perspective as a representative of the innovators, how do you overcome the attack that is often made that, you know, it's big bad pharma, right? It's these companies are making all this money on the backs of patients, and yet we have a unique situation. And whether their argument about the big bad pharma is accurate or not, we know that many misunderstand that in terms of the way that the risk-based investment is made into innovation. But when you're talking to these policymakers, is there something that some technique or argument that can be made that offsets that misinformed claim?
Yeah, I think obviously one of the things we like to talk about is the fact that bio member companies, while it includes a lot of the larger multinational pharmaceutical companies, really is comprised mostly of very small innovator companies that are really using cutting edge research to ultimately, in some instances, cure diseases that were thought incurable just a decade ago. And also we are working on therapies in disease states that would have never been considered years ago because there's been such a great breakthrough in technology. So it's playing that small company aspect and explaining to them that this is a broad ecosystem, that we're not all large companies, that some of these are very small companies that are not turning a profit. They may have a drug on the market, but they have not seen a return on their investment, and a significant investment that they've made. But we also do like to mention that this is an ecosystem where if you attack big pharma, and if your policies are hurtful to the innovative nature of big pharma, you're going to hurt all of these other small companies down the line. And I think it's interesting. We talk to a lot of legislators who want to increase the life science industry footprint in their state because these jobs are for highly skilled individuals. There's a multiplier effect for every one person in the industry directly employed in the industry. Another 5 people are indirectly employed in other ancillary services. And we impress upon them the fact that, you know, you need to keep the incentive in this industry and to keep this industry growing and to possibly attract a life science industry in your state, you got to make sure that the legislation and the policies that you advance protect that innovation.
Well, that's a great answer. And I know that when I served as chief of staff at HHS, the issue of starving out risk-based innovation was brought to mind with me when we went out to St. Louis to recognize what was then the most successful neonatal intensive care unit in the country in saving babies. And when we made this award and recognized this unit, the administrator of the unit said, well, we really appreciate your being here to recognize the great work that we've done where we saved these babies. He said, but next year we're shutting down. And I was shocked. And I said, why? And he said, because you've changed the reimbursement system for healthcare delivery, and the money that was available for us to run this unit, which is a loss because we could never recover the cost of the equipment and the technology that's necessary to save these babies. We just can't do it. We can't afford it without a recognition of that being a part of it. And I think that applies here, where you see the same kind of perhaps well-intentioned efforts to squeeze down on healthcare costs, and they punish the wrong people or the wrong sector of that innovation. And so I think that your point's well taken, that we need to be able to convey to these policymakers that this is a unique situation where you have a small patient population that is doing the work of the angels in saving lives. And that sometimes has to be trumped by the cost factor that they like to bring up. So with that, Representative Kennedy, you've sat on the other side. You're on the receiving end of these messages, and you obviously have to wrestle with the allocation of resources from the state level. How do you deal with, from the Medicaid program perspective, with the federal government in the allocation of the actual costs that are picked up? What advice would you provide in your experience for the rare disease community to approach these issues with legislators?
Well, Mac, there was a couple of things I'd point out. So in 20 years of chairing the Corporations Committee, David Carlucci is correct. When you're bringing somebody into the room who is dealing with one of these type of rare diseases, and asking the legislature to look at perhaps moving forward with legislation to address an issue, it really is one of those tug at your heart type situations, because you recognize perhaps by passing the legislation, we can help a family or we can help this child. The flip side to that, as much as they have an impact, we also recognize that the Blue Crosses of the world, the United Healthcares of the world, the Humana, the America's Health Insurance plans, they're going to be lobbying just as hard to try to convince us not to pass a piece of legislation. And we will always get the same response from them. This is going to drive up the cost of everybody else's healthcare in the state of Rhode Island. And do you really want to pass a piece of legislation like this? Now, Mac, I think the most difficult thing that we've had to deal with over these last several years, since the passage of the Affordable Care Act in Washington, D.C., at the time that that was adopted, each state had to list the type of mandates that they currently cover. And Rhode Island is a very mandate-rich state. So cost of healthcare in Rhode Island is higher than it is in many of the other states. But we want to make sure that we're addressing everything from breast cancer screenings to for those who are dealing, for the men with the prostate cancer issues, to have their screenings done, etc. So we followed what the federal government put down in that Affordable Care Act, and we listed all of those specific mandates that we could cover. However, any new mandates that have come up, this is, I guess, the difficult situation that we have to deal with. It has already been stated, any new mandates that come forth that we pass in the state of Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island, not the ratepayers in Rhode Island, but the taxpayers in Rhode Island would become directly responsible for the cost of implementing those. And that's something that becomes a big unknown, because if you do pass something new, what is it going to cost the taxpayers of the state of Rhode Island to implement. It's one of those issues that we have fought with. And a perfect example I would point to, Mac, was a couple of years ago, while we recognized that all of the major health plans were covering intravenous chemotherapy products, they weren't covering a pill to do the very same thing. We actually had to send a letter to Washington, D.C. and get a response back to ensure that a pill, which does the same thing as an IV drip, would be covered. And when we finally got the letter from Washington, we were able to move forward with that legislation. So there are so many factors that we have to look at. And one of those is protecting the taxpayers of the state. We recognize the importance of trying to address these rare disease issues, but at the same time, we have to look at all of the factors, including, cost to health care plans, as well as the taxpayers.
Well, thank you. That's great perspective. Senator Carlucci, you again were on the receiving end of a lot of these appeals. What's been your experience and recommendations you would have as patient advocates and patients themselves make their case for unique coverage for rare disease patients?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we know what we're looking for, right? That in issues like this, I think lawmakers want to help. They genuinely do. And I'm really excited about the breakthroughs in technology and modern medicine. And it's exciting. What I'm concerned about is that regulations and policies keep up with modern medicine and the breakthroughs that are available. And that's only going to happen when the people that are involved in this effort can tell their story, but do it in a succinct way. And that's where I think we have to know, okay, what do we need? What regulations do we need to change? An example for me was working with a young girl named Dream Shepherd. And she had at the time, a breakthrough technology. It was a stem cell transplant. She was suffering from sickle cell, and she was able to go into remission, and it wound up working for her, that surgery. But anyway, what happened was when she was discharged from the hospital, her mother was then told that she had to maintain the intravenous line that was directly into her heart. And that was a real problem and a real hardship. And insurance wouldn't cover the care to have a professional come in and maintain the intravenous line. And so we worked on legislation that would require that type of care in New York State. And I just bring that as an example that, Randy had talked about it, that there's so many other things and hardships that go into this, that it's not always just so black and white, if you will. That there's a lot of, it's a domino effect, if you will. And that's where the only people that can do that well is the people that are living through it and know, hey, you know what, this needs to change. And this is how we can improve our quality of life. And I say that because I think the most important thing is to make sure that you're addressing the lawmakers, but you're telling them what needs to be done. We can't wait for the state legislatures to come up with great policies. I think we'll be waiting a long time. They mean well, but they've got a lot of work to do. And that's why it's up to us to really come up with the policies that we think would be the best. Not worried about how much it costs or political opposition, but knowing, hey, this is the goal that we need to achieve. Focus on that and go forth with those plans and ask lawmakers to sign on the line and sign on to our cause. So I really think that's the essence of it, that we tell our story, but we always leave with an ask.
So you've raised a great point, and I'm going to put Representative Kennedy on the spot a little bit, because in terms of efficiency of identifying the state policies, it seems like going to the National Conference of State Legislators, where you might have a model legislation that could be advocated for. Representative Kennedy, do you believe that that's the appropriate way that would be more efficient in order to recommend these kind of policies that would serve all rare disease patients across the country?
Well, I would definitely say if we could get to that point of coming up with a national model on an issue such as this, I think that would really make a huge difference moving forward. because I think it would be hashed out within the committee structure and ultimately would be something that the states could bring forth. At the same time, keep in mind, one of the key things that NCSL does is they lobby the federal delegations in Washington, D.C. That's what sets it apart from many of the other legislative organizations out there, is the fact that we actually have boots on the ground that will go and contact the various members of Congress and let them know this is what we're looking to see implemented at the federal level. So if we could come up with that type of national model, I think that's a great idea. It's interesting, Mac, this past legislative session, I actually, it was my third year of introducing a piece of legislation to address the cost of insulin. We know what happened to that at the national level and how individuals and families saw the cost for insulin just spike through the roof. We pushed through legislation this year where we have set up a defined copay for that in the state of Rhode Island. And now at the national level, we're starting to see a similar plan moving forward where it will also stipulate that. A lot of states have come up with different cost structures to make this work, but Rhode Island, we came up with our own that we thought would work. We finally got a buy-in from the health insurers, even though America's Health Insurance Plans, again, that organization is really difficult because they only look at things from a national perspective, and they hate to see one state adopt something because it could basically create a tidal wave going on to the other states. So if we can get NCSL to push for the adoption of something, I think that changes the dynamics.
Well, thank you. And here's the good news for those that are listening, and perhaps more difficult news for Representative Kennedy is that RAP is a member of the NCSL Foundation, and that we are scaling up our participation there in order to advocate for the very thing that you've just identified, Representative Kennedy, as being a very important part of the communication and the formulation of policies that might have a tremendous benefit. But I think that it's a perfect transition to talk about the federal government, where you indicated NCSL as one of their roles is to go and advocate to the United States Congress and to the executive branch on issues that are adversely impacting the states. And clearly, when it comes to the burden that's required to provide coverage for new innovations that are incentivized by federal policy, and clearly the Orphan Drug Act, the various iterations of the Cures Act, that all have created at least a pathway for these rare disease therapies to be researched and then submitted to the FDA for approval, and then, by the way, ultimately submitted to CMS for reimbursement authority. That's an important process. But even then, the federal government doesn't guarantee that the coverage will occur at the state level. So for the purposes of talking about the federal government, what role does each of the panel members believe that the federal government should have in resolving the problem where you have these high cost therapies that are being approved and are ready for reimbursement, but yet don't seem to get to the patient? So I'll start with Randy, if she could give her perspective on this, in terms of the federal role and what needs to be done by the federal government to help here.
Thanks, Mac. And I'll be super brief on this because I have been working mostly at the statewide level. But I think that, an important comment, and for those of you who were around for the luncheon, I think early screenings and having access to a diagnosis early is super important. I don't think that that's issues that the state necessarily has the capacity to take care of with state taxpayer dollars. So I think making sure that newborn screenings are happening across the country similarly, and that those those RUSPA approved diagnosis are in the panels across every state, that each state doesn't run it differently, is super important to make sure that we get access to care as soon as possible, especially for those rare diseases that have really timely diagnosis and treatment options available. And then for our babies that are in the PICU, I was really super involved at our children's hospital on the Parent Advisory Council and Ethics Committee, and how many times our providers are chasing diagnosis to make sure they're treating patients the way that they should be treated with an ultra rare disease, is a lot of money spent that if we had some good panels available to check to see if a patient has a rare disease early in the treatment options, that would be absolutely life-changing for a lot of families. A lot of rare diseases take almost 2 decades to get a diagnosis for. So I think that that's really important.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I know with respect to spinal muscular atrophy, which is one of the rare diseases that requires early screening, it was very frustrating. It took a long time to get through the federal process to be approved. And when that happened, for the addition to the newborn screening panel, then we found out that it took in some states as long as 3 years after the federal approval to get approved. And to be added, in particularly in California, was a 3-year period. And there's got to be some reform there to streamline that process. And I think a partnership between the federal government and the states would be appropriate. And perhaps that's something NCSL can help with. Crystal, what's been your experience in this area about the role the federal government plays and how interactions with the state would help?
Yeah, thank you. I was involved in this quite heavily back in May when I was invited to testify at the U.S. House Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee hearing on drug pricing. I testified as a subject matter expert for the rare disease community. And we really have to understand, and I think it's been raised a couple of times today already, that a lot of this research is initially seed funded by the families themselves. And then we really rely on follow-on funding from the NIH, VCs, and other small biotechs and biopharmaceutical companies before treatments get either acquired or licensed to larger pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical companies. And I think the CBO was overly generous in what the drug pricing regulations would do, and especially when it comes to the rare disease community. I believe that it would decimate innovative research. So I think that we don't have enough data. So something that I'm doing is I participate in a work group. We're getting ready to introduce legislation at the federal level that would secure ICD-10 codes for all rare diseases. We need those codes so we can take a look at what the clinical cost for a rare disease is in comparison with the treatment cost when there's an approved treatment. And I think that we need to make them understand that these innovative treatments do not exist in a vacuum. And it's either we're paying for this or we're paying for nothing. It's when we don't pay for these innovative treatments, we're having patients with poor health outcomes that are in the smaller number of patients that are driving the majority of our healthcare spending. So we're doing a cost shifting, and not only that, we're also doing a cost reducing when you forecast these treatments over time. And so we want to see policies that really take those considerations into mind.
That's terrific. And Crystal, I need to introduce you to a new member of the Texas legislature who is a former member of, or former chief of staff at HHS in the last administration, who just got elected in a special election. His name is Brian Harrison. He had hoped to be on our panel today, but they have a retreat for the legislature in Texas. But I think he'd be a great advocate. He understands the healthcare system. So I'll make sure I connect you with him going forward.
Thank you. I welcome that.
Great. Patrick, you've been on both sides of this. So tell us what does the federal government need to do to solve this problem of patient access to help the states get the delivery of these therapies to their patients?
Yeah, I mean, I think we always get nervous when the federal government gets involved in drug pricing. Admittedly, we're very nervous right now. But there's a few things that, as I look at some of the state issues right now that we're dealing with, I mean, we're starting to see an unprecedented attack on the accelerated approval process at the FDA, and a lot of rare diseases are approved through that approval pathway. You have state Medicaid programs. As a matter of fact, I just saw something yesterday where the Oregon Health Authority, which is Oregon's Medicaid department, wants to submit a 1115 waiver to CMS to restrict access to therapies that have gone through the accelerated approval process. I think it's incumbent upon FDA and it's incumbent upon CMS to reinforce with these state Medicaid offices that accelerated approval is a full, legitimate FDA approval pathway, and that Medicaid programs have to, by law, provide access to these therapies because they are fully approved FDA therapies. That's one thing. It's just reinforcing existing statute and reminding state Medicaid programs of their obligations under federal law. I think, to Crystal's point, and this is something I have, since I've been in the industry, we've been trying to drive home with state policymakers, is that you have to look at drug pricing in the totality of healthcare costs. And if you're continually looking at the price of a drug and not looking at how it's going to reduce healthcare costs down the road, you're never going to pass an effective health drug policy, health drug pricing piece of legislation. Because if you look purely at prices and pharmaceuticals, you're going to impact access to the therapy. And I think it's very dangerous when we look at this siloed approach to controlling healthcare costs.
Great perspective. And so, Senator Carlucci, from your position, what frustrated you most about the federal government not helping to resolve these issues of patient access?
Oh boy, where do I start? Well, I wound up running for Congress and losing that election, and that's why I'm not in the Senate anymore. But it gave me time to think about that, exactly what I talked about before, that it's really frustrating when you see great opportunities. Representative Brian Patrick Kennedy talked about the oral versus the intravenous and how it can deliver the same results, but one is covered and one isn't. And there's so many examples of this over and over again. And that's the real frustration, that real help can be delivered, people's quality of life can be improved, and what's standing in the way? Bureaucratic red tape. So at the end of the day, I mean, that's really the frustration, but that's why I'm grateful that organizations like this exist to focus that energy and focus this concern towards actually getting results. And I think that with an aggressive campaign in terms of talking about what's exactly needed, can do a world of good.
Yeah, thank you. And it will pivot to this last issue, and it's probably from a patient perspective, the most vexing one, because we know, as Patrick just informed us, and he's right, that when there is an approved, FDA-approved indication in a rare disease therapy, the states are obligated to reimburse for it, and they don't in all cases. And in fact, the states are very creative in creating barriers for a patient to get access. And it's extremely frustrating when you look at it, because you know the needs for these patients are real. You know that the law is clear, and yet the states, because of, and their excuse is, of course, that it creates a financial burden that they find to be unbearable and that they cannot resolve because of the high cost of these patients. And so that really gets to the bottom line of how we're going to find some way in order to address these kinds of issues in moving forward. So if I could invite Randy to kind of give her perspective, both as a former state legislator and as an advocate for rare disease therapies, what do you think the states need to do to improve their adherence to the law and resolve these problems that they believe, and they're real, about in terms of patient access through financial resources that the states need to have access to?
Mac, it's a great question, and anybody who's following this issue knows Ohio is really in a challenging moment right now. The state passed some legislation to move to a single preferred drug list. They have a single pharmacy benefit manager. They have an administrator that's going to oversee our pharmacy benefit manager, because we had a state pharmacy benefit manager that we proved was wasting a lot of taxpayer dollars. And so we have been really looking at this issue from kind of a holistic point. And so we're trying to drive that home with our Medicaid. And I think that that's something at 3:30 today. If anybody is interested, they're going to be talking about value-based payment arrangements with our Medicaid department on our Joint Medicaid Oversight Committee. So I'm going to be nervously watching that presentation, because I think that's, that's where we're kind of moving. And I think, it's not really a Medicaid issue, but it could be at some point. We have to start looking at employer plans and how employer plans are moving to self-funded plans and under ERISA. ERISA hasn't changed at the federal level at all. And so, in the specialty pharmacy world, which is where most of our rare disease patients are getting access to their drugs, they're moving our specialty pharmacy benefits outside of the essential health benefits. They're carving them out, and they're doing all kinds of things to our patient populations. They're putting really high out-of-pocket costs on. They're carving them out or lasering out complete treatments for a complete diagnosis. And what they're telling, what they, being the third-party administrators of these programs, are telling the payers, which are our employers who are running these ERISA plans, is don't worry, they'll find a way. They'll find a way to get the treatment. If it is through, directly getting it from the drug manufacturer through a bridge program or a free product program, they'll find a way. But that's not sustainable, and it's not something that we can do. I wish I could reach my son's medications supplies here for you really quickly. I wish I would have thought of it, but it's sitting right next to me at my desk. I mean, he's got 3 carts full of supplies that go with his medication. If he's getting the manufacturer is sending him product to be a bridge program, that literally comes with his medication, but not his needles, his syringes, his sterile drapes, not his alcohol swabs, not his compresses. None of that stuff comes with that, and so it's not sustainable. And that's going to drive more patients to Medicaid. And if they continue to push us out of employer-sponsored services and providers, then we're going to be forced to go into Medicaid. And I have worked very hard to try and make sure that our son stays out of Medicaid and stays in a private plan. We have been able to manage that between changing employers, and before the ACA, we were close to maxing out a plan when he had cancer and hemophilia, and we switched plans. I figured out a way to do it mid-year. And so, I mean, we're all trying. And I think that's the important thing. And I think remembering that we all need to be at the table. It's super frustrating. I was just in a stakeholder group IP meeting about a non-medical switching bill that is in the state of Ohio, and the PBMs Association was there, the Plans Association was there, there were a couple patient organizations there, and they're all pointing fingers because bio and pharma aren't at the table. I'm like, did you guys invite them? Like, are they all invited? Because that's the thing, like every time a conversation happens, there's not a full drug supply chain of people who are touching this system, all sitting at the table at one time. And I think that's really why the push for the rare disease advisory councils is kind of taking off across the country. It's definitely why I introduced the language and why it was able to pass here in the state of Ohio pretty quickly, because we were very clear that we needed to have everybody sitting at the table to address these issues, because it's impacting all of us. It's impacting the state through the budget. It's impacting employers. Ohio's population is decreasing, it's not increasing. And I think that there's a clear issue there that we can point to, that we need to support employers in the state of Ohio providing good benefits to their employee population. So I hope that's helpful, Mac.
It is, and all I can say is amen to that. Patrick, from the innovator side, what do the states need to do to clean this problem up?
Well, you know, Randy touched upon this, and this is something we've been working with a lot of our member companies. Some of them are members of RAP as well, is trying to pass legislation in the states that incentivizes, or I shouldn't say incentivizes, that pushes state Medicaid programs to look at innovative payment models for some of these therapies. Because as you well know, they don't fit the traditional Medicaid fee-for-service payment model. And they are very innovative payment schemes that manufacturers have developed with other payers that work for these therapies, and they're based on outcomes. They're based, you know, they're pay over time, a whole series of different types of payment mechanisms. And I think, you know, Kip Piper had mentioned this earlier in his talk about the fact that while this does, you know, the state Medicaid programs are very reluctant to do things that increase their administrative burden. And admittedly, entering into some of these innovative payment models does increase some administrative burden on state Medicaid programs. But at the end of the day, it's a very responsible way for them to, very budget responsible way for them to help provide access to these therapies. So we worked in Ohio to get this legislation passed last year with Bluebird Therapeutics, one of our member companies. We're working on legislation in California on this. We've been able to pass it in Texas and some other states. And in some states, the state Medicaid programs have been very receptive to it. In other states, you do have to get the legislature to nudge them a little more. But I think that's one sort of easy fix that states can look at to help provide access to some of these rare disease therapies that don't fit the traditional fee-for-service model.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation. Crystal, from your perspective, what do the states need to do?
Yeah, I think they need to hear more from the patient. So we're really looking at all of the pathways that we can reach out and speak with our policymakers. We've requested a rare disease listening session. As Mike mentioned earlier, we only have session in odd numbered years. So coming up in 2022, we don't have a session, but that doesn't mean that we're not doing anything. We have a lot of legwork to do during the interim. So our legislative briefings, showing up at the DUR board meetings and advocating for coverage of these and partnering with the specific rare disease that indication. And we have a value-based committee as well. So patient organizations and patients can go to that and comment as well. Any of the avenues that we can reach to make them understand how important it is to not just have these treatments covered, but to have them covered timely. Because when we don't cover them timely, then not only is the state still going to end up paying for the treatment ultimately, but then the patient's outcomes are not going to be as great. And then they're going to have additional costs associated with clinical care and educational accommodations and interventions. So we want the coverage as early as possible, so we improve the health outcomes and then also reduce the state spending that is associated with these conditions.
Yeah, great, thank you. Senator Carlucci, we've heard horror stories about rare disease families that get into the pipeline for coverage through Medicaid and they get blocked time after time. What's the way around that from your perspective and experience?
It's a good question. And one that I don't have a great answer to, one that has been a constant struggle in that we've tried to reform, in that it's one that you don't know what you don't know. And, you know, I think about often the families that don't have access or, you know, the knowledge about even contacting their state lawmakers and have really been, you know, not benefited by the bureaucracy. And I think about how there's a lot of people that are just left out that, you know, don't have access and to advocate. You know, you think about all the horror stories from people that, you know what's going on, have, you know how to lobby the system, and yet still have these problems. So we've talked about in New York, you know, reforming the front door in terms of how you access it. Some of these facilitators to be able to walk people through actually accessing those benefits. And that's a real problem, and the one that we need to continue to reform and figure out, how do we do this best? How do we make sure that people are getting access to the services that they're entitled to? And then how do we continue to grow those services and make sure that they're fitting the needs of our time? But that's a work in progress, and one that we need to figure out and see how can we continually make it easier for people to access the services that they need.
Thank you. And Representative Kennedy, you get to give the last answer on this, and hopefully the holy grail answer about how we get patient access for rare disease patients.
Mac, I wish I could give that holy grail of an answer. You know, a couple of things. When Randy was given her remarks about this, and she talked about trying to get all the parties to the table. At the NCSL, we've had an insurance task force for the last 3 years. And as part of that, one of our biggest attended sessions always is when we bring in the folks from Farmer and the folks from AHIP and the folks from the PBNs. And usually we get one of these. Somebody points in this direction, they're responsible. And the other one points in that direction, they're responsible. No one wants to take responsibility for what is happening on the drug pricing. What we're trying to do in Rhode Island right now, because this issue has come up over the affordability issue, is particularly for those people, for example, who are on dialysis. Rhode Island, at the current time, anyone who's under the age of 65 is not able to purchase a Medigap insurance policy, which would help to address some of the financial distress and the inability to basically afford good medical care coverage. So we did pass a piece of legislation out of the House earlier this year. Unfortunately, it got tied up in the Senate at the very end of the session. But what we were concerned about, as a perfect example, we've got about 1,700 people in Rhode Island who are dealing with end-stage renal disease. And because they can't purchase these Medigap insurance policies and they're under the age of 65, they can't get a transplant. Unless they can show that they can escrow $100,000 into an account for out-of-pocket expenses related to the transplant surgery and the related post-transplant care, they're taken off the list. So we look at there have to be options. I'm going to be introducing that Medigap insurance policy coverage back in for the 2022 session when we get back in January. But we've got to look at solutions. And as long as we've got organizations like AHIP that are always shooting down these ideas because of the fact that they don't believe this is the way we should be doing it, it's going to make it difficult. I want to see more of these rare disease type things covered in the state of Rhode Island. But we have to look at who's impacting and who's trying to get to the decision makers to prevent these things from moving forward.
Well, thank you. And I think that in our future, you're going to see a very active request from RAP to have a similar kind of discussion at the NCSL that you have with your task force on insurance issues, because this is the way we resolve these kinds of barriers, by having those discussions and making sure all the parties are in the room. So that no one can escape the responsibility and accountability along the way. So thanks to each one of you. I think we've had an extraordinary discussion. I know it's being recorded and it will be circulated around to those who are unable to join us in person today, but we're very grateful to each one of you. I'm going to turn it back to obviously to the leadership here. And I know that that we're going to continue this discussion as we go forward. So whoever, Mike, if you're the next guy up to hand it off to, I'll pass it off to you.
I am. Thank you, Mac. And thank you for your panel. As Mac had pointed out, we are going to be making this conference live on our website. We will also be making sure that it gets in front of people who we knew couldn't make it today, as well as share it through various networks through the community. So when that information comes to you, feel free to share it. Feel free to let your colleagues know that the RAP conference is available to them. Sorry, I'm just pulling up my instructions here from the team. And so we'll turn now to our state wrap up, and we have a special guest. And I'd like to turn the time over to Angie to introduce our special guest, and then we'll give the time over to him.
Oh, actually, Mike, not quite time for the special guest. So I think we were scheduled for a state wrap up.
Oh, my instructions kind of merged those together, so I apologize. Yeah, my instructions merge those, Angie. I apologize. They're not clear here. So let's talk a little bit about where we're moving in the future. As Mac alluded to, 2022 is coming up. And I'd like to also include Jeff and Mac on this part of the discussion. We at RAP have identified 7 states that we will be moving into to work closely with patient organizations, industry partners, et cetera, moving into the legislative session in 2022. We have already underway are building a workshop to review some of the RAP priorities. And you've heard many of our priorities in some of the discussion today. But in particular, we will be putting forward information on patient participation in Medicaid decision-making. As many of you have experienced, this can be a frustrating process, both for patients and families, as well as others who really want to advocate for access to a certain therapeutic or a certain treatment. And so one of our big priorities moving into next year will be to have model information that can be utilized to draft legislation at the state level, depending on your need at the state level, to empanel patients as active participants in P&T committees and DUR boards. And so that is a big effort that's going on next year. As Mac alluded to, we are also going to be expanding our footprint with some of the organizations in which we participate. For example, NCSL, NBCSL, ALEC, and others, where we are going to be building panels, working on health disparities in rare disease populations, and of course, patient participation in decision-making and access. And so there's a lot on the state team's plate. And so we want to open it up to allow for a little bit of dialogue like we did at the end of the federal session. Angie, was that a good tee up?
Mike, if I could just add, at least from my perspective, in looking back at the way that the government, the federal government has addressed these kinds of issues in the past, there's a model for there being a unique cost sharing for rare disease patients. We saw this happen with the cost of transplants, and we knew that the burden that would be placed on the state Medicaid programs to fully fund a transplant was simply something that would not work. And so there was an accommodation made and I think Patrick said it right. You look at the financing mechanisms that are available, and we have to find ones that allow for access to these needed therapies that are high cost. And it takes some effort, but unless we get this discussion started, we'll never move to that point where we've come up with these financial access mechanisms that can be used, and that we allocate the burden of those either through some financial setups that allow for it to be paid over time, a longer period of time than just in the first budget cycle, for example. And we all know the way the government works on budgeting. They look at year 1 or year 2, and in some cases they'll go out to 5 years, but you will never see the government recognize offsets the cost savings for the reduction in high cost treatment of patients that are resolved with the new therapy, even though the therapy is a high threshold cost. We need to be aggressively advocating for there being these kinds of financial mechanisms that recognize the reality that we all confront, both in terms of the patient and their family, and in the innovators being in this business to create these valuable life-saving therapies, and the responsibility the government has for those government beneficiaries to have these therapies covered. And we need to stop the nonsense that happens at the states where they erect artificial barriers to avoid responsibility in the hopes, and in many cases, sadly, the patient is no longer a problem because they passed away. And that happens too often in this country, and we don't accept responsibility for it. So if we're going to be truly the model for healthcare delivery in the world, which the United States has been, if we're going to truly maintain that stature, we're going to have to apply ourselves and get public policymakers at the federal and state level to start to apply themselves to looking for those solutions rather than looking for ways out of meeting their accountability for it.
Absolutely. I was going to mention that, if we're talking about creative solutions, and I know, Patrick, you may have some views on this as well. At RAP, we have been looking at reinsurance as potentially one of those solutions for rare disease drug coverage and access. And we've had some really positive meetings with some of the state Medicaid programs, particularly as they realize that pooling in an insurance product gives them a number of benefits that include some of the things that Mac had talked about. The ability to allow those participants who are contracting now, which would be the reinsurer and the manufacturer, to enter into performance-based contracts and other innovative 21st century payment. And so there are some creative ways that we can continue to pursue these solutions. And I agree with Mac that it's all about urgency and making sure that we can deliver that sense of urgency at the state level as we're offering them these solutions.
Well, Mike, I can give you one example that I think sort of illustrates the problem. With SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, there are two primary therapies currently approved by the FDA. And the way that the bean counters look at this, they look at what the cost of the treatment is in year 1 and year 2, and maybe even year 3. So the two therapies that are available, one is, and depending on the status of the patient, either one would be appropriate. But the first therapy that was initially approved by the FDA requires for an initial dose in order to address the effects of the loss of muscular neurons in SMA. And these babies need to be screened immediately. They need to be dosed immediately in order to address the problem, because otherwise the muscular neurons are lost and the patients become profoundly disabled and ultimately die. So the cost of the first year of the original treatment was, I think, around $700,000. The second therapy that was approved is probably the most expensive drug or gene therapy that's been approved by the FDA that's available in the marketplace today. And it probably costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.6 million. I'm not sure that's the exact number, but that's the ballpark number. That's a big expense. Year 1, you look at 1.6 million versus $700,000, and you say it's a no-brainer. You only reimburse for the $700,000 treatment. What is sometimes not recognized is that the $700,000 treatment requires every year a lifetime of dosing 4 times a year that averages out about $350,000 or $400,000 a year. Whereas the second therapy, the 1.6 million, is a one-time, and that's it. And the patient either responds and has what is close to a full cure, or the patient fails. But most of them succeed on that. So 1.6 million in year 1 versus a lifetime of 700,000 first year, 300,000 or 400,000 after that. I think the numbers are pretty clear if assuming the appropriateness of the treatment is adequate or appropriately treated to the baby for which therapy. You talk to the people that score these things, and they don't look at it this way. They look at it only as what's it going to cost us in this year, and they're not accountable for who has to fund it in out years. That's why we have to have this discussion, because that same kind of model applies to many rare disease therapies when these government officials that are trying to stretch their money in order to have the most effective coverage for the largest number of populations lose rare disease patients in that calculation. And we need to be in their faces and talking about how they need to allocate money to preserve against the horrible consequences of not treating these patients, because they, as we all know, they fall into high cost environments, again, which is not accountable in the budget model. But the reality is that the state or the federal government have to pay those costs when the patient deteriorates to the point that they have to be hospitalized 24/7 and ultimately end of life care that's enormously expensive. Those are the kinds of issues that we're confronting, we have to deal with on a regular basis. We need to confront those issues now and get these policymakers to grasp this, and why it's so important, for example, that we go and have these discussions at NCSL, and with the support of our sponsors, which we're very grateful for. It allows us to do that because that takes resources in order to get the attention, because we're competing for time at NCSL and we want to be a major player there. So that's one thing that we can start to do, and get these patient stories in front of them, get the practical solutions to be evaluated, listen to the other stakeholders and whatever their challenges are, and respond to them. And then ultimately we come up with a policy that will make a real difference in the lives of these families that have these rare disease patients that they are taking care of, and that they're protecting and preserving their lives.
Patrick, Angie, any other thoughts? I know we still have Kelly on.
Yeah, I guess what's on my mind is from the collective minds on the phone. What should we be preparing for 2022 as some of our priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak to some of that because we're obviously getting prepared for the 2022 legislative session. But even though Congress is dealing with HR 3 or the Build Back Better plan that has a lot of drug pricing provisions in it, prescription drug pricing is still going to be a major issue of consideration in state legislatures. We're starting to see the proliferation of prescription drug price review boards. As you know, Maryland was the first state to establish one of these, and these boards really look at prescription drugs. They treat them almost like a public utility, and many of them have the ability to set an upper payment limit, or which is a very nice word for price control on a particular therapy if they deem, or if a third-party value assessor, i.e. ICER, deems that the cost of a therapy isn't worth the value of the therapy is not worth the cost. This is going, right now, I think they're looking at some specific types of older therapies, but I could definitely see in the very near future that some rare disease therapies, given their high cost, even though they're high value, but given their cost, are going to become the focus of some of these prescription drug review boards. So we're very active in pushing back on these where we can. And at the very least, trying to remove the ability to set an upper payment limit on these medications. We're also seeing increased activity in international price referencing. We've had a number of state bills that have been introduced last year. Thankfully, none of them passed, but would peg the price of prescription drugs in a given state to what is paid for that same therapy in Canada. So this is not just a federal issue, it's now bleeding into the states as well. And there's a whole host of other bad ideas. And quite frankly, they're being pushed by NASHP, the National Academy of State Health Policy, who has gotten quite a bit of funding from the Arnold Foundation to push these types of bad ideas and ill-informed ideas. So it's incumbent upon us to get out there and explain to legislators the problems with these therapies. I'm sorry, the problem with these policies, and especially, and part of that is really hitting home on the rare disease side, because you are, as Matt mentioned, you are in the rare disease community. You are on the side of the angels. You're dealing with, these are therapies that years ago we wouldn't be considering developing them, and now we are, and we're able to try and protect a very vulnerable portion of our population. And I think some of our opponents on the drug pricing side fail to see that. So it's incumbent upon us to go in and meet with legislators and explain that to them. We at Bio are going to start once again, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to continue to push on the alternative payment legislation in a number of states for next year. And I think we'd like to work with RAP on how do we get more patient participation on drug utilization review boards. I think that's incredibly important. We've worked in a number of states and we're working in a number of states to see if we can try and build some transparency around some Medicaid processes. As you know, some states are very good at letting manufacturers know what the process is to get a drug reviewed through their for coverage. Other states are not good at that at all. And so we're trying to work with states where we see that as a problem to make that system a lot more transparent and provide manufacturers, patients, and clinicians that are dealing with these therapies more our participation in those drug utilization review board proceedings.
I think that's exactly right, Patrick. And I cannot tell you how many P&T committees I've been to where you'll go through all the clinical review and all the discussion and dialogue amongst the P&T committee members, and then they end the meeting and they say, okay, now if you've got something to add, now we have the public comment, and patients are relegated to the end of the meeting where they have to move through very quickly through the line to give their maybe minute or two of impact statement, why this is important or what needs to be done. And I think that's really a large shift, and that large shift was opened up to us because of the Cures Act, where now we have educated patients who know, as you can recall from our beginning panels, they understand natural histories, they understand clinical trial design, they understand the therapies because they are involved in the development, they understand the FDA process, they understand the accelerated approval pathway, and yet they're not being listened to when it comes time to say, okay, here are the parameters for access, and be able to explain that to others who don't know those therapies as well as now these educated expert patients. And so I think that's really important. And again, something that Cures Act opened up to us is having now a generation of really educated patient advocates. I see a hand.
And I know that Patrick